Scientists, archaeologists, and history buffs would probably give anything for the chance to climb into a time machine and finally provide a definitive answer to a long-standing, tantalizing question. How did the ancient Egyptians manage to erect these monumental pyramids without the aid of our modern technologies? And were these stone giants really just tombs for pharaohs of monumental stature? Or did they have an entirely different, hidden purpose? The good news is that you don't have to wait for the invention of a time machine to get closer to solving these age-old mysteries. To understand how the pyramids were built, attention and careful observation are enough, and to see their original purpose in a new light, sometimes it is sufficient to acknowledge that much of what we have accepted as settled knowledge about ancient Egypt needs to be revised. This is not a call for sensationalism, but an invitation to look at familiar things from a different angle. How long would it actually take to mentally travel back 4,500 years? Far from half an hour. In fact, if you get in a car or take the subway in Cairo, it takes only a few minutes to reach the gates that open onto a long-departed millennium. Giza is not just an archaeological complex. Arriving at the world-famous Giza plateau, a visitor is confronted with a sight unlikely to fade from memory. The stone giants here astonish not only by their size, but by their mystery. They remain among the most awe-inspiring and inscrutable monuments of the ancient world. Even among these monuments, one structure stands out with particular grandeur and significance. For centuries, the Pyramid of Khufu was regarded as the most venerable. It is the one usually called the Great Pyramid. And for good reason. With an original height of 146 meters and 60 centimeters, it remained the tallest structure on the planet for more than 4,000 years. Even today, this wonder of ancient engineering rises approximately. Once its entire exterior was covered with a smooth casing of gleaming white Tura limestone, which made the structure dazzlingly bright in the sun. Unfortunately, in the Middle Ages, that casing largely disappeared, and today we see only a massive framework of roughly hewn blocks that still holds many questions and mysteries. The summit of Khufu's pyramid was once crowned by the so-called pyramidion, but that final capstone, likely made of granite or basalt, is now also absent. By common consent, the Pyramid of Khufu served as the majestic and imposing tomb of the ruler of the same name, as a number of inscriptions attest. Nevertheless, skeptics who doubt the classical theory of the structure's funerary function point to a significant gap in the evidence. Inside the monument, no mystical funerary texts, no lavish grave goods, and no mummy of the deceased have been found. The only item that can be cited in support of the traditional view remains the sarcophagus, or at least for many years researchers have explained the absence of items by total looting, which could have begun in pharaonic times and continued thereafter. However, there is still no definitive answer to whether the pyramid was completely stripped of its treasures, since only a small part of it has been studied. You undoubtedly recall that last year scientists announced the discovery of a new, previously unknown chamber inside the Pyramid of Khufu. This cavity, 2 meters high and 9 meters long, has so far resisted a clear interpretation, and it is unknown what other archaeological discoveries may lurk behind its walls. To date, researchers estimate that only about 10% of the structure has been mapped, and among the finds are only a hook, a granite sphere, and a few fragments of wood. No one knows exactly what other secrets its heart conceals, but as an old proverb has it, sometimes it is enough to look closely into the face of a stone companion. Technical progress makes such observations and virtual journeys through monuments of the past available in a few clicks. There were times when the grandeur of ancient buildings reached us only through blurred shots taken with. Today, however, high-resolution images captured by unmanned aerial vehicles reveal these stone giants in full detail, allowing us to study their surfaces, seams, and any unusual patterns with even the faintest traces on the surface sometimes prove extraordinarily informative and can spark thoughts about how and why a particular element was built. What can these traces tell us about the construction of Khufu's pyramid? To understand this, it is worth examining photographs taken directly above the structure's apex. At first glance, one thing is obvious. The placement of the stone blocks is far from the perfect symmetry we might imagine. As the image is enlarged, ever more details come into view. Every crack, every cut line or tool mark tells its own story. The photos reveal a variety of elements: graffiti left by people over the centuries, beveled surfaces. All these details are informative in their own way and can provide a key to understanding the technologies and events associated with the pyramid's construction. For viewing convenience, the contrast of some frames was enhanced so that the finest features of individual stones would become more noticeable. A metal frame that had previously marked the presumed original apex of the structure was also removed from the images. Looking closely at the very top, one stone block stands out as noticeably darker than its neighbors. It is unlikely that this is due to a different stone composition. Other photographs suggest the block may have been damaged or stained as a result of a fire or some other incident. By zooming out slightly, we can take in the entire summit, and the surface then presents itself as a unified picture where each detail fits into the overall scheme. Hidden among the middle blocks is an intriguing, almost imperceptible element. A small hint: pay close attention to the direction in which individual stones are oriented. This may help you spot the detail in question. Does this look like a chaotic pile of irregular stone blocks, or is there a discernible system and interrelation in their arrangement? Before moving on to explanations, it is worth noting the difference between the marginal stones and those lying closer to the center. On the flattened top of the pyramid, the border blocks are almost perfectly aligned with the base. Their edges correspond exactly. The inner blocks, however, behave differently. They exhibit an overall clockwise rotation of roughly 5 to 10 degrees relative to the edge elements. If specific zones are color-coded, this deviation. One of the main hypotheses among researchers is that the ancient Egyptians used complex ramps to lift and set the massive blocks. In this context, it is natural to suppose that during construction of the central sections, the outer layers were encircled by a spiral ramp, and the inner blocks followed the direction of that inclined path rather than the sides of the pyramid. The simplest and most logical method for precise alignment is to orient blocks along the edges. Hence, the border stones were set in strict accordance with the structure's axes. The internal elements, however, may have been laid parallel to the spiral trajectory of the ascent. This would explain their uniform rotation. Some researchers regard this observed pattern as a strong argument in favor of the spiral ramp being used, at least at the summit of Khufu's pyramid. Only questions about the extent to which this technique was used in constructing the lower layers give cause for doubt. Nevertheless, identifying a characteristic method in one section significantly increases the likelihood of finding the same technique elsewhere in the same structure. Such a systematic approach to analyzing the alignment of blocks helps reconstruct the logic of the ancient builders' choices, not by adding new facts, but by interpreting deviations already observed. The idea that we are looking at an ancient power plant sounds provocative, but not surprising. People rarely limit themselves to the simplest explanations, such as ramps. Perhaps recall how the Great Pyramid of Khufu once shone, thanks to its white Tura limestone casing. When completed, it reportedly resembled a gigantic diamond, flashing in the midst of a lifeless desert. Is it not perfectly reasonable to suppose that this radiance had not only a decorative, but also a functional role? Light can be produced by any system capable of emitting charged particles into the surrounding space. This is exactly how the polar lights form. When high-energy charged particles intrude into the atmosphere and interact with the Earth's magnetic field, a spectacular display of flashes and bands of light appears in the sky. To erect a structure capable of serving as the source of such a glow, ancient craftsmen would have needed a material with high conductivity and an installation operating at high frequencies. That is why samples of Tura limestone from the Aberwash area drew attention. Laboratory studies revealed that the conductivity of this stone increases at higher frequencies, to such an extent that it was classified among unusually. However, a conductive substance alone would not be enough. To generate high-frequency waves, the structure would have had to be surrounded by substantial masses of Earth, an empirical observation familiar to specialists considering such hypotheses. If one assumes that the Great Pyramid of Khufu was conceived as a generator of electromagnetic radiation on a planetary scale, then its location seems far from accidental. What could be better than a geographically, in theory, an electron-emitting structure would have to deliver charged particles to the ionosphere? Between the summit of the structure and that zone, lay a gap of roughly 100 kilometers. Penetrating the ionosphere, the electrons would collide with gas atoms and produce a glow resembling an aurora. The charges would then return to the surface via elevated areas. Approaching the Giza plateau, such electrons, according to the hypothesis, pass through water-filled caves, thereby completing their path to the ground. The search for and disclosure of the alleged cave passages were first brought to public attention by Sahik. According to their version, a process usually called electrolysis took place in these underground spaces, in which water broke down into gaseous hydrogen and oxygen. The resulting gas mixture, accumulating in enclosed cavities, created significant pressure. Interestingly, numerous texts describing the pyramids do indeed often mention vibrations and subterranean tremors. However, beyond the mechanical impact, the monument's complex internal structure likely played a key. According to this version, water molecules were split in one of the underground chambers, while only the released hydrogen was needed to produce light. Rising upward, the hydrogen gas gradually filled the queen's chamber, as well as the southern and northern shafts, which necessitated special barriers. That is why, the researchers suggest, the mysterious Gantenbrink doors were installed. They were meant to keep the gas within the system and prevent its escape. As the pressure inside the cavities increased, so did the temperature of the gas, which in turn could lead to the partial release of electrons. A copper clamp adorning one of the doors was supposed to conduct electromagnetic energy within the system, after which the hydrogen would be ionized. The purpose of the king's chamber, according to the hypothesis, was to accumulate free electrons. Flowing from the chamber's granite beams could have been used to create the necessary electric field. What is traditionally interpreted as Khufu's sarcophagus is seen in this model as an element of a high-voltage generation system, intended to ionize the hydrogen and keep the chamber in a conductive state. But it should be emphasized, although such a reconstruction sounds plausible, it is not supported by reliable evidence. Even if one accepts the assumption of a light source, open questions remain. Why would the ancient Egyptians have needed to stage such a light spectacle, where they would have obtained such advanced technical knowledge? And why is there not a single mention of such a... At first glance, the situation seems simple. The many alternative versions only generate additional questions, not bringing us closer to a definitive answer. If one recalls school history lessons, it is clear that the Great Pyramids on the Giza plateau, according to the commonly accepted view, they served as lavish tombs for the pharaohs, meant to be the final dwelling of their bodies and to guide the ruler's soul to the afterlife. However, even with this seemingly obvious explanation, the question inevitably arises. How accurately do our textbooks actually reflect historical reality? Many skeptical researchers answer it briefly and categorically. We cannot be certain. On the contrary, proponents of unconventional interpretations argue that what the stone monuments directly tell us points to a different purpose for these structures. They suggest that, to see this, one should set aside learned. It's important not to oversimplify. Even among those proposing alternative versions, one rarely hears the claim that the pyramids were never used as tombs. As an example, they usually cite Djoser's ancient step pyramid, which is indeed referred to as a tomb. Nevertheless, it is striking that its construction and precision of execution differ noticeably from those seen on the Giza plateau. Why, then, does the purpose of these structures remain a matter of debate? One paradox is that the ancient Egyptians left a vast number of written monuments and hieroglyphic texts. Some historians even note that the Egyptians documented many aspects of their life and activities with great meticulousness. And yet, surprisingly, in the catalogs of their records, there are virtually no... Put simply, there is no surviving record known to us that gives a detailed account of how the pyramids and the Great Sphinx were built. And where reliable sources are absent, unconfirmed guesses and speculations quickly arise. To understand how the ancient Egyptians managed to erect gigantic stone structures intended to last forever, researchers turn to various theories and hypotheses. Most of these explanations are based on the assumption that relatively simple means by modern standards were used. Soft copper tools and elaborate ramp systems for raising the blocks. However, none of these versions has received definitive confirmation due to the paucity of archaeological evidence, and therefore they remain largely conjectural. More importantly, The pyramids impress not only by their scale and the labor required to build them, but also by the remarkable precision with which they were executed. Take, for example, the Pyramid of Khufu. Its base is oriented with exceptional accuracy to the four cardinal directions. The deviation in the length of a side of its base is less than 1/1000th of the side length. How this was possible in conditions where modern measuring instruments and machinery did not exist remains a mystery to many. If one assumes that the Great Pyramid was merely the pharaoh's tomb, a natural question arises. Why did it need such a monumental, gigantic form and such impressive dimensions? With an original height of almost 147 meters, it held the title of the tallest structure in the world for a long time. Shifting mentally to another type of royal burial, we find ourselves in the Valley of the Kings, near ancient Thebes. This necropolis essentially arose several centuries after the construction of the Giza pyramids, and was conceived, among other things, as a way to resist raids by tomb robbers. Although both the pyramids and the tombs of the Valley of the Kings are officially considered tombs, their interiors differ sharply. Tombs in the Valley of the Kings are equipped with spacious passages, branching galleries, and are richly decorated with paintings and hieroglyphs. Passages inside the pyramids, however, are often so narrow that an adult has to literally squeeze through them, and the interior chambers are marked by an unusual simplicity and plainness. Why the same abundance of artistic decorations and inscriptions is not found in the pyramids, if both categories of structures serve the same funerary purpose, remains one of the pressing questions prompting further research. Perhaps a small bypass leading into the depths of the Khufu pyramid sheds light on this question. If one enters the structure through a narrow corridor measuring 90 by 90 centimeters and then proceeds downward, one may come upon a kind of underground chamber that remained officially unfinished. Why the ancient Egyptians descended 3 levels, only to then halt work, remains a subject of debate and speculation. Those who enter through the doorway must overcome a few steps to ascend further. Many visitors do not suspect that the current arrangement of the passages is partly the result of recent installations. Originally, there was nothing in this place but a steep, sharply rising corridor. Beyond this narrow passage opens a spacious gallery. Visitors seeing it full scale for the first time marvel at its dimensions. A height of 8.74 meters and a length of 46 meters. Many who have been inside note unusual acoustic effects that manifest in the large gallery and make a strong impression. Some researchers and ordinary visitors perceive this acoustics as a hint of some now lost special function of the chamber. The official view, however, tends to be that the gallery primarily served a structural purpose, as an element stabilizing the mass of the structure. Specialists believe a similar role belongs to other internal spaces of the pyramid. Those hoping to find spectacular decorations or mystical inscriptions deeper inside will be disappointed. Beyond there is no other sight to expect, only austere architecture and engineering solutions. What the royal chamber actually looked like. At first glance at a cross-section of the pyramid, one feature immediately stands out: the peculiar arrangement of the so-called king's chamber. It is essentially the only known royal burial chamber from the period between the 4th and 6th dynasties, whose ceiling is, instead of the usual 2-sloped roof, the builders laid 9 massive granite beams on the walls, each more than 6 meters long, which inevitably required the construction of special chambers above them. The reasons for choosing this scheme remain a matter of debate, but there is no doubt that the sarcophagus itself remains the central and most significant element of the royal apartments. Although no funerary goods or even a mummy have ever been found in Khufu's pyramid, the presence of a massive granite sarcophagus clearly indicates that we are dealing with a burial place. Nevertheless, it is this sarcophagus that raises many questions and skepticism among researchers, because it deviates from the overall artistic and structural scheme of the monument. Even the most cautious archaeologists admit that in execution, the sarcophagus is noticeably inferior to the flawless masonry of the royal chamber. In other words, compare the impeccably fitted blocks of the walls. Visible tool marks and unpolished edges lead many specialists to wonder and to compare this object with the rest of the chamber's finishing. These external discrepancies have given rise to the theory that the sarcophagus may have been placed in the burial chamber significantly later than the pyramid itself. Old photographs of the king's chamber, showing debris and loose pieces of stone around the sarcophagus, have been used to support this hypothesis. Some observers suggest that these scattered fragments could be parts of a lost sarcophagus lid. Moreover, a number of awkward questions arise. Why the sarcophagus is not positioned in the center of the chamber, as one would expect for a primary burial? Why it bears no inscriptions or hieroglyphs? Why the usual decorations and ritual markings are absent? These gaps in the object's decoration and placement leave room for a wide range of interpretations and speculation. The answers to many of these questions apparently were known only to the ancient Egyptians themselves, and their full account of events remains unavailable to us. One must also not ignore the problem of transporting the materials, which remains a separate mystery. Indeed, the bulk of Khufu's pyramid is built from limestone that was quarried and worked right at the construction site. The situation with the granite is different. It was brought from quarries in Aswan, roughly 800 kilometers from the Giza plateau. And finally, the very fact of the extensive use of granite raises questions. We're talking about roughly 1 million blocks of this durable stone, and one important question inevitably arises. Why did the ancient Egyptians switch from the familiar limestone to heavy, hard-to-work granite? Doesn't the very choice of this material indicate that it was intended for a specific, even specialized role? Or perhaps the decision was dictated solely by aesthetic considerations, rather than practical necessity? This question remains open and deserves attention. The next important point is that most of Khufu's pyramid still remains unexplored, and we were reminded of this relatively recently. In the spring of 2023, specialists announced the discovery of another previously unknown chamber inside the Great Pyramid, which again confirmed that there may be more hidden spaces than commonly thought. During work at the Sphinx, geologist Robert Schoch used ground-penetrating radar to reveal a hollow in the statue's head. Aerial photographs complement this discovery, also showing an apparent opening on the Sphinx's crown. As early as 1925, French Egyptologist Émile Barrès and his research team measured this hollow and then sealed it with cement. In surviving photos, a worker is seen standing directly in the hollow, and an iron hatch was found at its base. Researchers suggest that originally this opening may have served to fasten the statue's headdress. Later, it was probably deepened in search of hidden chambers or secret passages. A team led by Egyptologist Dr. Manu Saif Zaid discovered, using seismic tomography, not one but several chambers beneath and adjacent to the monument. They estimate the largest of them has an area of about 100 square meters. Scientists propose that these rooms could have been intended for storing treasures or libraries of ancient texts. One of the rooms is located directly under the statue and is therefore considered the most likely place for treasures. At the same time, Saif Zaid expresses concern that since the time of construction, the chamber could have become flooded and its contents looted by treasure hunters. The myth that an ancient library is hidden beneath the Sphinx has been circulating for quite some time. The first to put forward such a hypothesis was the American astrologer Edgar Cayce, but his assumption never received any real evidence. Former Egyptian Minister of State for Antiquities, Dr. Zahi Hawass, rejected the idea of intact chambers beneath the Sphinx, although he acknowledged the existence of 2 tunnels under its bulk. At the same time, old photographs of the Sphinx are striking and fuel many conjectures. They clearly show a wooden walkway stretching in front of the statue and neat limestone blocks laid from it to the paws and between them. From their appearance, it is easy to suppose that these blocks could have served as covers for one or more hidden chambers. Particular attention is drawn to a mysterious hole. One is located in the lower part of the hind paw, near the Sphinx's tail, and belongs to a structure roughly 4,500 years old. This opening is usually unnoticeable and remains hidden from prying eyes. British archaeologist and historian Dr. Batoni Hughes regards it as a kind of secret entrance and suggests it may lead to a large hidden chamber inside the statue. She speculates that such a chamber could hold concealed secrets and possibly valuable treasures. Dr. Hughes also hypothesizes a possible connection between the tunnel and the ancient Egyptian ruler Ufu, whose burial, she believes, lies in a pyramid near the Sphinx. At the same time, scholars admit that they cannot yet say with certainty where these passages lead or what objects might lie beyond them. Dr. Hughes, however, is convinced of the existence of a small chamber directly beneath the pause, but archaeologists have still not determined what it contains. Researchers hope that the described secret tunnels may be connected to other underground passages and chambers that contain yet unexplored treasures. Regarding the discovered passages, archaeologists tend to believe that there are a total of 3 secret tunnels beneath the Sphinx. The first was found in 1937 by a French engineer at the rear of the statue when he was inspecting the structure in search of possible treasures. The second tunnel is on the northern side of the statue, but it is currently flooded. It is believed that in ancient times treasures and monuments were hidden there. The third tunnel was discovered by an Italian adventurer in the early 19th century and is located between the Sphinx's 2 front paws, behind what sources call the portrait of the dream with Tella. Ultimately, the state minister himself, Zahir Awaz, ordered excavations under the main body of the Sphinx to clarify the purpose and contents of the discovered passages. Directly beneath the Sphinx, a system of tunnels was found. Apparently, these cavities formed naturally and are not man-made structures. Nevertheless, archaeologists believe that beneath the Sphinx, there stretches not a single network of passages. During the restoration of an extensive palace complex associated with the name of Emperor Nero in Rome, researchers came across a secret underground vaulted chamber. Inside it were images of a panther, centaurs, and, including, a sphinx. This room belongs to the ruins of the so-called Golden House, a vast palace built by Nero, which later suffered as a result of the Great Fire of Rome in the year 1964 AD. The chamber was discovered accidentally, when archaeologists were erecting scaffolding for work in an adjacent room. In addition to the figures, scientists found rich wall paintings depicting flowers, birds, and aquatic creatures, which gives the place the character of a secluded repository of artistic images. To this day, a significant part of this chamber remains filled with earth and unopened, and, in the opinion of experts, it may never be fully revealed, since further excavations could seriously undermine the stability of the vaults and jeopardize the integrity of the monument. The Great Pyramid of Giza is also shrouded in many myths and mysteries. To date, archaeologists and scientists do not possess all the information about the internal structure of this pyramid. Some of its sections have been explored, but many remain concealed. During the work, a void was revealed located 30 meters above the so-called Grand Gallery. The gallery itself leads to the so-called King's Chamber. Little is known about the find so far. Researchers have been unable to definitively determine why this chamber was created and what function it served. It is possible that it had no specific purpose at all, and that it is merely an architectural miscalculation or a technological void. Such cavities in building structures are not uncommon. An alternative hypothesis is that it could have been simply a free space that workers used as a supporting void during the construction of the rooms located below. For example, the construction of the famous Grand Gallery was only possible with At the same time, this void could have been either a single volumetric chamber or a system of large interconnected galleries. The underground world of the Pyramid of Giza holds far more secrets than the recent. Researchers have identified an extensive network of chambers and tunnels beneath the body of the pyramid. These passages and rooms remained hidden for thousands of years and are still accessible to only a few specialists. As new passages are discovered and studied, the number of questions only grows, and each new fragment of the structure gives rise to new hypotheses and doubts. Similar uncertainty concerns other pyramids around the world. We have only a small portion of the information about how and why these monuments were erected and what secrets they hold. Let us talk about the burial chamber of Tutankhamun. In 1922, the tomb of this Egyptian pharaoh was found in the so-called Valley of the Kings. He died at the age of just 19, and unlike many other royal tombs, his occupant was found intact. More than 5,000 items were discovered inside, most of them made of gold. Since then, many legends and conjectures have arisen around this tomb. Radar surveys fueled archaeologists' hopes that behind the walls of the famous tomb, there might be another, previously unknown chamber. Some have suggested that, according to current theories, she was the wife of Tutankhamun's father, Pharaoh Akhenaten, and her remains have still not been identified. Scholars allow that, because of Tutankhamun's sudden death, there may not have been time to prepare a separate suitable burial. In that case, the priests could have opened and repurposed an existing tomb of Nefertiti to find a hidden spot for the new burial, where the young pharaoh would have found rest. In any case, archaeologists tend to think that there should indeed be another chamber behind the north wall of Tutankhamun's tomb. High-precision radar and infrared thermal imaging have revealed that behind the massive wall of solid rock, there is something distinctly different. The most plausible hypothesis suggests the existence of an empty chamber, possibly a continuation of Tutankhamun's tomb. Such a discovery is not surprising in itself, given that many ancient structures around the world surely hide additional secret chambers and tunnels. We do not even suspect many of them today, which means archaeology still has a great deal of work ahead. It must be acknowledged, in the future, this field will undoubtedly yield exciting discoveries that will help us better understand the face of the human world millennia ago. And yet the contrast between our scientific achievements and our incomprehension of the past is striking. We have sent probes to distant planets, decoded the genetic code, and split atomic nuclei, yet we still remain baffled by piles of stone erected 4,500 years ago. Such a statement may seem somewhat exaggerated, but it accurately reflects the essence of one of the main archaeological mysteries of our time, the question of how the ancient Egyptian pyramids were built. Is it fair to assume that these gigantic structures were erected solely with simple copper tools, primitive earthen ramps, and purely human labor? How viable are such hypotheses when one considers their colossal scale and flawless geometric precision? Anyone who turns to official specialized publications on the architectural masterpieces of the inhabitants of the Pharaoh Empire inevitably encounters cautious phrases, presumably, approximately, estimated. This is largely explained by the scarcity of archaeological information. After all, did you know that only 3 artifacts have been recovered from the Pyramid of Khufu, and that these items were by no means precious relics of a burial rite, and were not a pharaoh's mummy at all? The find proved rather unimpressive. A sphere, a hook. The usual explanation for the absence of significant artifacts is simple. The Great Pyramid, it seems, was completely looted many centuries ago. But, given the paucity of finds, many ask a much deeper question. Was this structure really built? Supporters of the traditional view point to occasional builders' inscriptions that include the ruler's name as an argument in favor of this idea. Skeptics, however, draw attention to the monument's unusual appearance. It differs noticeably from all known Egyptian. Despite these disagreements, the prevailing view remains the same. The pyramids of Khufu and other similar structures are seen as massive tombs, meant to embody the power and grandeur of the ruler of their time. Even if there is not much direct archaeological evidence for this function, traditional ideas about the construction technology seem plausible. In that era, Egyptians, according to available data, did not even use the wheel, yet they manually shaped enormous blocks, weighing several tons into almost perfect geometric forms. These massive stone blocks were then transported to their destination, sometimes over distances of hundreds of kilometers. And during construction, the heavy blocks had to be balanced atop one another, using a complex system of ramps and devices. Over a period of roughly 20 years, they created a monument so perfect in craftsmanship that not even a sheet of paper could fit between the limestone blocks. The stone mass completed at the end of construction consisted of 2,000 tons. This elicits as much admiration and raises as many questions as the exterior appearance of the structure. The internal layout of the Pyramid of Khufu is no less astonishing. Much of its interior remains virtually untouched and little studied, so the mysteries surrounding it have not diminished. You surely remember the sensational discovery that made headlines in March of last year. Scientists managed to discover a previously unknown chamber inside the Pyramid of Khufu. The purpose of the void, over 2 meters high and 9 meters long, remains a mystery, as does much else hidden within the Great Pyramid's depths. Taking advantage of the sensational find, scientists reminded everyone of another astonishing fact. To date, we know only 10% of the volume of the Pyramid of Khufu. Specialists traditionally single out only a few well-documented chambers, The King's Chamber, the so-called Queen's Chamber, the Grand Gallery, and the subterranean chamber cut into the bedrock, and nothing more reliable. At the same time, the very name Queen's Chamber is misleading. Its origin is linked to a misinterpretation of Arabic writings, and therefore the true purpose of this room remains unclear. What is known more specifically about the Queen's Chamber? Inside it, several narrow shafts have been found, which raise many questions for researchers. These channels begin roughly 1.5 meters above the floor and have a very small diameter, about 20 centimeters, which makes them difficult to traverse and mysterious by nature. Before the Scotsman Wayneman Dixon rediscovered them and forcibly opened them in 1872, the shafts had been tightly sealed. During his coarse but productive examination, he also came across 3 objects that are usually in. However, many questions arose. Why place such items in a sealed shaft, and why were they hidden there? Another puzzle concerns the dating of the wooden fragments found. Modern radiocarbon dating indicates that the wood is roughly 500 years older than the pyramid itself. Some scholars explain this by noting that wood in ancient Egypt was a scarce and valuable resource and could have been reused repeatedly over a period of about 500 years. Nevertheless, there is another viewpoint. According to some researchers, the great age of the artifacts may indicate that the construction of Khufu's pyramids began significantly earlier than is commonly believed. To this chain of mysteries, a further strange detail was added. A robot that surveyed the hard-to-reach sections recorded hieroglyphs on the walls that are not yet fully understood. And returning to the shafts of the Queen's Chamber, it should be noted that the northern channel is blocked at roughly 40 meters. There is a firmly driven iron bar there, serving as a conspicuous and as yet unexplained obstacle. What this barrier is and why it was installed remains beyond our understanding for now, and these questions still await answers. The official version claims that this bar may have been left during the shaft inspection by a man named Dixon when he was working blindly, unable to see the space ahead of him. We learned of the existence of this strange relic thanks to the German engineer Rudolf Gantenbrink, who in 1993 carefully explored the ominous corridors with a miniature robot. Since the discovered iron bar made further reconnaissance of the northern shaft impossible, Gantenbrink and his team switched to the southern counterpart of the passage and focused their efforts there. After proceeding a little less than 2.3 meters, the passage suddenly made a sharp 40-degree bend, and another 55 meters on the robot, lowered into the shaft, finally came face to face with a polished limestone block. The block was adorned with 2 heavily weathered copper fittings, and many specialists, looking at it, saw something resembling a door. To look behind the stone barrier and discover what lay beyond it, in 2002 the block was drilled through, but hopes for a sensational result were not realized. Behind it, the researchers found only another small cavity, which they considered might be the end of the shaft. Nevertheless, the northern shaft again attracted the attention of scientists, but attempts to continue work once more met an impassable stone barrier with copper fittings. Only in 2011 were the blocking block and the small chamber behind it re-examined. With the help of a robot named DJD, equipped with a movable endoscope, specialists made several noteworthy discoveries. A new 360-degree survey showed that the rear side of the barrier was also polished smooth, and the copper fitting forms 2 eyelets. Moreover, DJD's camera recorded several red marks on the floor of the small chamber, which the researchers regarded as a kind of builder's graffiti, that is, presumably, marks left by those who constructed it. A broader question remains open. Was Khufu's pyramid an ancient power plant? And what were these shafts in the Queen's Chamber intended for in the first place? Why did the ancient Egyptians lay out passages that end in the so-called void? If these narrow passages were really just ventilation shafts, then the fact that they do not lead outside seems at least strange. Some researchers have pointed this out as illogical and do not hide their surprise. Why create ventilation that goes nowhere? There are other explanations, and one of them takes us into the realm of religious symbolism. According to this version, such corridors served not for air, but for the pharaoh's soul. Through them it ascended to the eternal sky. Proponents of this idea argue that the shafts pointed the ruler the way to the imperishable stars of the northern sky, and were part of a mystical route to accomplish such a ritual ascent. In their view, false doors and special ritual passages were required, intended to symbolize the path to the divine realm. However, concrete technical questions arise. If the shafts of the Queen's Chamber really performed the role of such corridors, whether as actual passages or so-called model replicas, then why do they terminate at a full 15 meters from the exterior surface? Wouldn't such a termination mean that the imagined soul runs into a dead end? Moreover, for an ascent to the northern sky, it would be illogical to construct a corridor oriented to the south. They also emphasize another detail. We are not aware of any other pyramid with this orientation of passages, which makes the described scheme even more original and enigmatic. Finally, it is necessary to remember the origins of our knowledge about the ancient Egyptians' beliefs about the afterlife. The texts on which such reconstructions of beliefs rely appeared only 250 years after the erection. There is also a radically different hypothesis that proposes abandoning spiritual explanations altogether. According to it, Khufu's pyramid was not a tomb at all, but an ancient technical structure, something like a power plant that produced illumination. In this system, it is assumed, the choice of building material was dictated by practical considerations. Limestone, it is claimed, has high electrical conductivity. An ingenious internal arrangement of the monument itself also played an important role, according to the hypothesis proponents. It is said that electrons supposedly moved through water-filled voids beneath the structure, undergoing splitting, and as a result, gaseous hydrogen rose into the Queen's chamber. Finally, the mysterious Gantenbrink doors are regarded as a safety element. They were installed to prevent that gas from escaping to the outside. The sinister copper clamps, spoken of by supporters of alternative hypotheses, in their view, serve not merely as decorative elements. They are said to have been designed to... The chamber commonly called the King's Chamber, in this interpretation, functioned as a kind of collector. Its task was to gather free electrons from the Queen's Chamber, and subsequently channel those charges toward the pyramid's apex. What many researchers take for the pharaoh's sarcophagus, in this scheme, ceases to be a simple funerary object and appears as an element of a high-voltage generation system. Its purpose was to ionize the air. Even if the hypothesis of a light source inside the pyramids is correct, many questions remain for which there are yet no convincing answers. Why would the ancient Egyptians need to create such a light spectacle? Where could they have obtained the technical knowledge necessary to realize such an undertaking? And why is there no explicit mention of such phenomena in any of the surviving ancient texts? These omissions make the field of alternative Egyptology rich not only in bold ideas, but also in new mysteries. What, then, really lies behind these gloomy tombs of the gods, whose what might their connection to the mysterious Sphinx be? What treasures or secrets might still slumber beneath the paws of that stone hybrid? Many ancient structures are lost in the shadow of their more famous neighbors. For example, have you ever heard of the Tomb of Osiris? This underground complex is, in essence, as much a part of the Giza plateau as the Great Pyramid of Khufu and the Sphinx itself. Yet it much less often becomes the focus of attention than its colossal above-ground cousins. And despite this, the traditions associated with this mysterious complex were passed down orally for 100,000 years. Unfortunately, modern researchers sometimes tend to dismiss such oral traditions as fantasies. This was the case with Herodotus, who, having visited the lands of the pharaohs around 450 BCE, recorded his impressions in the second book of the Histories. In one of his works, the Greek historian described a mystical tomb hidden beneath a rocky hill at the foot of which the great pyramids tower. Herodotus wrote that an artificially created lake surrounded an island on which the pharaoh Cheops rested. These ancient accounts have come down to us, but they had one significant drawback. Many simply did not believe the described place was real. It took more than 2,000 years before the legendary account became linked again to archaeological finds. In 1933, the Egyptologist Selim Hassan discovered this hidden site, and thereby reminded the world that historical testimony should not always be immediately dismissed as myth. Discussing his discovery, other scholars, however, doubt that dating and consider it more likely that the constructed structure is much older than the discoverer supposed. The interior, called the Tomb of Osiris, struck observers as mysterious from the very beginning. The rediscovery of the hidden complex was undoubtedly an archaeological sensation, but it did nothing to reduce the number of questions. The place still confounds and fuels the boldest hypotheses. The complex more closely resembles a winding labyrinth. Its space consists of a network of tunnels and chambers, and the descent down a shaft into the stone underworld becomes a truly dizzying adventure. Only a few photographs and film reels that captured the carved inscriptions on the stone have survived to our days, but even these scant records drew researchers' attention. Since 2008, the Egyptologist Zahi Hawass has been actively working on deciphering and revealing the long-forgotten secrets of the Tomb of Osiris. Essentially, the complex is built on 3 levels arranged in cascade. One level descends deeper than another and opens new clues for those willing to go down. The first chamber measures roughly 4 by 10 meters, yet contrary to expectations, it proved strangely empty. No funerary texts, precious relics, customary grave goods, or even a sarcophagus were found here. The emptiness of this chamber only heightens the mystery of the complex and raises new questions instead of answers. Fortunately, the second-level chamber turned out to be arranged somewhat better than the upper rooms. To reach it, you must descend one of 2 iron staircases that have clearly seen better days. Once you're down, at a depth of 18 meters below the surface, a spacious cavity measuring 5 by 8 meters will open before you, divided into 8 niches. The pots and bones found and analyzed in detail here allowed experts to conclude that the tomb was built in the late period of ancient Egypt. The human remains that lay in the massive granite sarcophagus in niche number 2 proved to be the same as the examined bone fragments. But something hidden behind that sarcophagus may be of even greater significance. The coffin itself partially blocks a narrow passage roughly 80 by 100 centimeters, leading east, that is, directly toward the Valley Temple of the Sphinx. It appears the sarcophagus was shoved into the corridor with such force that it broke. Many skeptical researchers believe this may have been done deliberately to create an obstacle. Given that access to the site is permitted only to authorized personnel, the obvious question arises: why was this particular passage blocked? In other words, what is hidden in the tomb of Ceres that others are not allowed to see, let alone study? The second and final granite sarcophagus on this level is in niche number 7, but it is empty. Like the chamber above, this room gives the strange impression of a bare, unadorned storeroom. It is this ascetic simplicity that casts doubt on the accepted date, around 500 BCE. At that time, the Egyptians typically decorated tombs with paintings, colorful reliefs, and countless inscriptions. There is none of that in the tomb of Ceres. The ceilings, walls, floors, and the sarcophagi themselves are completely bare, resembling constructions of much earlier dynasties. For example, structures like the Giza pyramids, the Serapeum, etc. Considering that ancient Egyptian burials were often reused, this possibility cannot be ruled out. The analyzed pottery fragments and bone remains may have been introduced from much later interments. In that case, the obtained dating results lose their reliability and do not provide a clear indication of the original time of burial. Nevertheless, there is one detail we have not yet examined thoroughly, and it requires separate attention. Why is this complex called the Tomb of Osiris? To answer that question, we must go even deeper underground and look into perhaps the most enigmatic of all the levels. The tomb. In their myth, Osiris, though venerated as ruler of the realm of the dead, was murdered by his brother Set. In a fit of rage, Set dismembered Osiris's body and scattered the pieces across the land. Fortunately, the god had a daughter-in-law, Isis, who gathered the scattered remains and, together with Anubis, was able to restore her husband to life, at least in the mythological account. Faith in that legend was so deeply rooted in the Egyptian consciousness that they created a separate symbolic burial site for the deity. According to the stories, This was not a genuine tomb of a living god, but rather whoever dares to descend the 2 by 2 meter shaft into niche number 4 on the second level will reach not only roughly 30 meters below the surface, but the very heart of the structure. If the upper corridors are of harsh, cold stone, down here the element of water rules. Selim Hassan encountered that water. He tried to drain the chamber completely, but after the pumps had run for no less than 4 years, recalling Herodotus's reports, the abundance of moisture in this part of the complex seems quite logical. The ancient Greek mentioned a funerary island surrounded by an artificial lake. Nevertheless, today the water in the spacious burial chamber apparently stands much higher than in Herodotus's time. Scholars are not yet able to explain with full certainty the origin of this water. Still, traces of the place's former appearance remain clearly visible below. The lid of Osiris's sarcophagus still projects slightly above the waterline. The rest of the tomb and that very island Herodotus wrote about are now entirely. This creates the sense of an unsolved ancient mystery. Although the general character of this section largely matches descriptions from old sources, it raises many questions. Some are practical and almost glaring in their simplicity. How did the ancient Egyptians manage to lower and maneuver a granite sarcophagus, variously estimated to weigh between 10 and 15 tons, to such a depth? Another intriguing fact is that the items recovered here date to roughly 5,000 years ago, making them about twice as old as the finds from the so-called second level. It is quite possible that the remaining submerged areas could provide answers to many of these questions. Unfortunately, reaching those places is currently impossible. In the eastern wall of Osiris, another equally narrow shaft leads eastward toward the Sphinx. During his investigations, Zakikovas naturally wanted to understand the purpose of these passages. That is why he sent a small boy into one of them. Some researchers suggest they are parts of an extensive underground network, directly connected with the legendary Hall of Records. It is said that this mystical repository of knowledge has an entrance supposedly hidden beneath the pause, but there is another line of interpretation, no less controversial in essence, though different from that version. Many proponents of alternative theories do not view the tomb of Osiris as a symbolic place of worship at all. They interpret it as physical evidence that the ancient Egyptians possessed techniques and devices that seem almost futuristic to the modern eye. The boldest of these hypotheses go even further, claiming fully functioning spatial portals, allegedly hermetically sealed by. Yet even if one sets aside such fantasies and remains cautiously skeptical, the tomb of Osiris still raises a number of serious questions. Why did Herodotus assert that Cheops was buried here? Why did the pharaoh live roughly 4,500 years ago, if the lowest part of the complex turns out to be at least 500 years older? And finally, how did the Egyptians manage to cut and finish shafts? These inconsistencies prevent the matter from being closed and call for further research and thoughtful discussion.